So I mentioned Cheikh Anta Diop, which is French, known in English as Cheikh Anta Diop. And he is a modern day African Renaissance man who's passed away.
Right.
From Senegal. He is paramount, prolific individual, and it is very important that we know who he is and his contributions to the world of literature, history, linguistics. He was a nuclear physicist,
especially in the field of Egyptology.
Egyptology, he was an anthropologist.
Because before Cheikh Anta Diop, the academic community of Egyptologists pretty much accepted the old racist view that the Egyptians were white people.
Yes, and he, along with Theophile Obenga,
who later came up behind him, one of his students.
And what happened with that? UNESCO was forced to admit that the ancient Egyptians were indeed African.
Exactly. And so...
At least in the first several centuries. Of course, they mixed with Greco-Romans later and so-called Arabs, which
but that's
part of the
Semites down the road. Right. The Egyptians already been there for hundreds of thousands of years.
What's that there? You got another Cheikh Anta Diop.
This is Cheikh Anta Diop, the African origin of civilization, myth or reality. And chapter 3, modern falsification of history. Now, the modern falsification of history really is the European falsification of history. The European, which was a process of the Europeans going around the world, wiping and denigrating, wiping the memory out of the original people and denigrating their old cultural norms and traditions, as though the original people didn't have no high civilizations, as though the original people didn't contribute to civilizations. One white man once wrote, I forgot his name, but he said the Negro has never contributed to none of the 21 civilizations on the planet Earth. And this is where you get white folk like Eric von Däniken, Zachariah Sitchin, and others who...
Zachariah Sitchin.
Okay. Zachariah Sitchin, excuse me.
It's all right.
This is where you get individuals like them. They come up with the alien theory for the development of ancient advanced civilizations. And I mean, here you have ancient black people talking about space travel. Here you have ancient black people talking about how planets are revolving around the sun. Here you have ancient black people talking about astronomical numbers and dates that they're just now finding out are true with the help of modern instruments. Indeed. And so, and these ancient people talked about these things, so they had to say, well, maybe these people came from the stars. But no, these people didn't come from the stars. This was no alien seeding life and developing civilization on Earth. This was ancient black people possessing high knowledge and civilization. But the Europeans, they came out of Europe in the 14th century, the 14th and 15th century with a bent idea of falsifying everything that they found and discovered of the original black nation.
Exactly. For example, here's a metallic object. It could not have come from Africa because in metallurgy, the science of creating metals, they thought, which has now been dispelled.
They believed it was from European origin.
Exactly. When there's a myth of African, actually it's not a myth. Many African societies, for example, Shaka Zulu, among the Zulu people, they would go to what? The pygmies, the diminutive people in the jungles, in the equatorial regions to get metallic objects. They believed they had power, correct?
Right.
Even in the movie, you saw that. Remember the witch, the so-called witch doctor? Have you noticed it was a pygmy?
Right. Metallurgy, that goes all the way back, according to Finch, about 40,000 years.
Is he quoting Charles Finch?
Yeah,
that's another serious scholar.
And so about 40,000 years.
Serious scholar.
About at least 40,000 years. And so they discovered steel. Africans had steel thousands of years ago. And so these things was a part of our civilization, but the European came out of Europe in the 14th, 15th, 16th century. It's like, oh, these people never contributed nothing to civilization. So, and this is where we move from the phase where here's cultural destruction. Yeah. Here's the destruction of culture. And we look at that, the destruction of culture, I look at that really coming from mainly the European, because there was no people that ever conquered other peoples and forced them to assimilate into their culture at the expense of denigrating or destroying what memory or recollection they have of their own culture. And so Europeans came out of Europe with their own European culture, and it was constructive for themselves, but it was mutually destructive for Aboriginal people and indigenous people all over the planet Earth. And so one of the main one of the main points that Europeans came with out of Europe was what I call and others call cultural imperialism.
Cultural imperialism.
Here's where you use your culture as being the dominant culture as a means of dominating and conquering another people through culture. And this is what still is taking place today. This is why the war started in Iraq. As George Bush himself said, this is an ideological warfare. We want to bring the Iraqis democracy. We want to free the Iraqis and give them democracy. Well, how the hell you know they want democracy, how American democracy is? Their culture is their culture. American culture is American culture. But here you have a dominant culture, a more powerful culture that has more guns, more weaponry, more high sophisticated technology that are able to actually conquer another culture via military and ideology. Culture. Here you have, but the same happened here in America with the Native Americans. The Native Americans had their own beautiful culture. It was an ecological culture. They was one with the animals, one with nature. They studied the stars. They believed in the Great Spirit. Everything was pretty much, for the most part, in harmony. Then the Europeans came. They thought they was going to be able to get along with the Europeans. Right. But then the European was bent on taking this land for himself. And the only way he could take this land for himself if he could conquer the mind of the Native American. And how do you conquer the mind of a people? You conquer their culture. You conquer their culture. And so what he forced the Indian to do, starting in 1820, they had a lot of Indian assimilation. In the 1820s, they started a lot of Indian assimilation programs. And the Indian assimilation programs was take them to white schools, so they get educated by the white man. They adopt the white man's religion, Christianity. They learn the white man's language and cultural norms. And so therefore, at the expense of denigrating, the white people denigrating and the Indian leaving his own culture in order to practice the European culture.
That is a hallmark of European history.
And no
doubt about it.
Yeah.
Denigrating and subjugating other people. Mm-hmm. The natives from around the world. Those who we call Native Americans.
And in fact, I even got a quote here. It says, through cultural imperialism, the leaders within the federal government attempted to make Native Americans into white men using various methods, including teaching them to read, teaching them to use their farming techniques, to become Christians, to become what they deemed as civilized. And we find the same thing taking place in the 1870s on up with the scramble for Africa. And what happened? They put the military and then they put the church in at the same time. You had missionaries and you had the military all working together to destroy the African civilization all throughout. And that's how they was able to conquer Africa then and even to this day.
Yes. And that's definitely hallmarks of a destructive culture under the guise of civilizing others.
Exactly.
There's a little snippet of some of the books we have here that we've studied and continue to go back to over the years. Very crucial. And we talked about cultural imperialism
as a means of destruction of other subjugated cultures.
And so, because when you adopt the beliefs of a conqueror, you lose your collective myth, the collective myth of your given culture, your ancestors, your people.
And so the question arose in my mind, how does a cultural people under the threat of cultural imperialism or destructive culture survive? And so when we look at it, I thought we got to talking about the examples of the Jews in Europe.
Yes.
And we were talking about how during one of the Inquisitions, how if you didn't convert to Christianity, it was a policy of get down or lay down.
Get down or lay down.
And so if you didn't get down with Jesus, you get laid down into the ground. And so a lot of the wealthy Jews and some other Jews that was living in Spain and then along the Mediterranean at that time, that was subjugated against these draconian laws implemented by the Holy Roman Catholic Church, so-called holy, they became what we know in history as conversos. And here they act like they were Christians. They got baptized like they were Christians, but they were still in private practicing Jews. Because one thing the Jew always has understood was the power of a myth.
The power of a myth.
And this is what
as a shield.
As a shield.
To encapsulate, to protect you from the destructive elements of the conqueror's culture.
Exactly, right? Exactly.
In this case, the European destructive culture.
And this causes
is unambiguous.
Right.
Who will argue that colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, the Holocaust, these are all hallmarks of European destructive wave.
Also the Inquisitions. The
Inquisitions
destroyed all the ancient cultures of Europe. You couldn't no longer worship Isis. You could no longer worship Mithra. You could no longer, the Nordics could no longer worship their god, or anybody that was, nor the early English couldn't worship their gods no longer, or their traditions no longer. They either had to get down with Christ, with Jesus Christ, or get laid down. And that was the policy of the Roman Catholic Church ever since it adopted Christianity as its chief religion. And so
in other words, convert or die.
Exactly. So the Jews, they understanding the power of myth, and we was like, well, dang, what is a myth? And one person that really highlighted a myth and specialized in it is a guy named Joseph Campbell. In the 1980s and early 90s, he used to be on PBS all the time. Unfortunately, he's not on there no longer, but Joseph Campbell makes some very powerful remarks about myth, what a myth is. And this is according to Joseph Campbell and popmatters.com. He said, myths exist to teach us about ourselves, others, and they show us how to live our lives. Myths serve more than just the folkloric functions in society of do this, don't eat that, be careful when traveling, etc. Myth is the field of reference, metaphors for what is absolutely transcendent. Myths, he says, and popmatters.com suggests, myths are the guidebooks for life itself with all its beauty and mystery. They reflect the concept of transcending duality, because everything comes in pairs or it has its opposite. There could be no good without evil. Myths, Campbell says, are the keys to understanding the whole of human experience. So the Jews, by still embracing their mythology, that they are the promised people of God, that they are the chosen people, that they have endured 400 years of bondage in Egypt, that they have endured bondage in Babylon, and that they were able to persevere through it all, that they was able to be endure the invasion and conquering of their lands by the Greeks and the Romans, and they were still able to persevere because they held tight to their mythology, and they used their mythology as a shield or a boat or an ark as a means of protecting and preserving their ethnicity.
Now hold that thought. Now contrast that to what happened to our beloved ancestors when we were stripped of the various beautiful myths of Africa and the regions wherein we were extracted.
Exactly. That left us with no foundation.
Exactly.
And ultimately, owing to the nature of the brain, we end up adopting some of the mythologies that white people shared with us. So this is where we began to pick up the Negro spirituals and the Negro spirituals. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. This is all a part of black people adopting the mythologies that was in the Bible and now transferring that and giving them a means of reference on how to deal with this beast or this horrible institution called slavery. And so when Master Farad Muhammad came in 1910, his first time coming to America, he said he had to study us for 20 years. And what he was doing was studying our psychology. He was studying our mind. So about time he made himself known to us, July 4, 1930, he came armed with an arsenal of a new mythology. A new mythology that acclimated the black man's greatness. That a mythology that gave us the idea that we was children of the God that created the heavens and the earth, and that we ourselves are God. That we had no birth record, no beginning or ending. He gave us a mythology or a story, whether we take it as literal or historical, but a mythology
which is nonetheless powerful.
And which is more powerful than anything else, actually.
A shield against the tyranny of the culture, the destructive culture of the conqueror.
Exactly. And so, and by us adopting his symbols, by us adopting the formulas and the mythologies that he gave to us,
right,
and the cultural norms that he presented for us, we had progress amongst black people. Here you had 1 million, almost 1 million black people galvanized to produce a socio-economic nation within a nation. We had our own schools. We had our own transportation in terms of logistics systems. We had almost 20,000 acres of farmland, fully functioning, productive farmland. We had our own cargo ships with trade imports from South America to North America on our own ships. We had our own industry. We was building our own aviation department at the airport in Gary, Indiana. We had progress as black people as long as we accepted and viewed the world from the mythology that Master Farad Muhammad developed for
So
us.
on that note, in many instances, we were doing that which worked for the Jewish collective, the Jewish Americans, and the Jews in Europe, the Ashkenazi, the Sephardim, the Ashkenazim, and so on.
The Jew would have never been able to survive in Europe if he did not hold tight to his mythology.
Exactly.
Here's a people, the Jew, that have been subjugated and treated the worst, almost just as bad as black people for a great period of time in Europe by Caucasians. And so, therefore, they were still able to hold tight to their ethnicity. They would still hold tight to their symbols and everything. And now they have emerged on the world stage as a very powerful people. They even have their own nation today. Yes. All because they kept going with the mythology that has been working for them for the last 2,000 years.
So we see the value of having your own myth leads to cultural solidarity.
And which leads to economic prosperity.
Which leads to economic prosperity.
And thus you have a beautiful example from an article dealing with the rise of Asian Americans.
Yes, most definitely.
And their economic mobility amongst them.
Economic mobility.
Whereas amongst black Americans, you don't find that mobility taking place because we lack our own mythology.
Exactly.
We have adopted the mythology of our conquerors.
Our oppressor.
We think we're Americans in the American dream.
But to them, we're not.
Well, to the reality, we're not.
As evinced by Donald Trump's popularity and his saying, quote, "Make America Great Again," and the success of that slogan.
Well, also,
which I wrote about that.
Also, we got classic examples prior to Donald Trump between the marginalization, the classic discrimination that takes place by not hiring felons, by not hiring people with dreadlocks, by not hiring people with certain. You got economic discrimination based off of people with low credit scores. They know that black people are predominantly the people with low credit scores, and so there's many forms of discriminatory practices that let us realize that we are not really a part of the American dream or the American culture. Exactly. And so we're just living here.
And what do you do in that scenario, that milieu? Here's a good example from our Asian brothers and sisters who also taste oppression and xenophobia and stigmas and so on.
But they held tight to their own mythology, which led to that cultural solidarity, as you just mentioned.
Asian Americans, CNN money, Asian Americans are quickly catching whites in the wealth race. And I'll zoom in so you can see that graph there. Hold it there just a little bit. Asians are on their way to toppling whites as the wealthiest group in America. Asians have had higher median incomes than their white counterparts, according to a new study by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. The typical Asian family has brought home more money for most of the past 2 decades. That fact, coupled with younger Asians' higher rates of college education, means that they will surpass whites in net worth in the next decade or two.
Wow.
Fed researchers said.
Wow.
Some 65% of Asians aged 35 to 39, our age, have a college degree, compared to 42% of whites, 26% of blacks, and 16% of Hispanics. Nearly a third of Asians that age have a graduate degree, more than twice that of whites. The share of blacks and Hispanics with advanced degrees are 9% and 5% respectively.
Wow.
Greater educational attainment has long been associated with higher incomes and wealth accumulation.
Exactly.
This pursuit of learning has helped Asians quickly narrow the wealth gap between themselves and whites, something we need to do. In 1989, the median Asian family had about half the net worth of its white peer. By 2013, they had more than 2/3. The gap between whites and blacks and Hispanics, meanwhile, remained little changed over that time period. So Asians have similar financial habits to whites in terms of investing and borrowing. Both groups are more likely than blacks and Hispanics to invest in stocks and privately owned businesses and to have more liquid assets.
Because they got more liquid assets in which to invest as well.
Exactly. And a feedback loop, which serves as a buffer against financial shocks.
And so here...
Mal, allow me to make a clarification, and many people, of course, won't agree with me, but I choose to call Indians from India because Christopher Columbus was sent out to find gold and resources to plunder, to steal from Indians. I call original indigenous Americans of a region we call America. They call it America, but there's different terms for this landmass that we call North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean islands. So why do I not call them Indians? Because they're not Indians.
Right.
Real Indians are from India.
Right.
I call indigenous people of the Americas natives. Indigenous, autochthonous is a term from anthropology. I feel that's a more befitting term.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I call them indigenous or native people
I see.
to these lands. Because the America is named after a conqueror and a murderer by the name of Amerigo Vespucci. And so therefore I don't even like to use the term American because that's the term of a conqueror. And here was a people that was 70 to 150, 200 million strong that got desecrated and demolished. And like, we live in Indiana, but I've maybe only seen an Indian once in my whole lifetime.
Exactly.
And so, that's which is a fine example of cultural destruction.
Yeah.
And we see how through warfare, through assimilation, and integration, the Indians was conquered.
Yes.
The Indians was conquered. He was conquered. He was culturally shocked by the arrival of Europeans to these shores and the development and the spread and proliferation of Europeans. He didn't understand their intent. And by being culturally shocked, he tried to adapt and survive to European culture in many different ways, trying to befriend them, not understanding the nature of this people was power, greed, and wealth. Yes. They did not care about Mother Nature, earth, and peace. Yes. As the Indians did, as the natives indigenous to America did.
Yes.
Now here you have other people since that time come to America, like we just said, the Asian American come to America. Now you have the Indian from the actual landmass called India, the true Indian subcontinent.
Let's talk about the true Indian from India as an example of a successful ethnic group in America that is about to become, if not already, the top earners or among the top earners.
Exactly. 5
facts about Indian Americans from the Pew Research Center. Many Indian Americans are recent arrivals. 87.2% of Indian American adults in 2010 were foreign born. The highest percentage among the 6 largest Asian American groups, 37.6% of those have been in the U.S. 10 years or less. One consequence of so many Indian Americans having arrived so recently, only 56.2% of adults were U.S. citizens, the lowest share among the 6 subgroups studied in detail. Point 2, Indian Americans are among the most highly educated racial or ethnic groups in the U.S. 70% of Indian Americans aged 25 and older had college degrees in 2010. By far the highest rate among the 6 Asian American groups studied, and 2.5 times the rate among the overall U.S. population.
Oh, wow.
More recent 2013 data from the American Community Survey provides more details. 40.6% of Indian Americans 25 and older have graduate or professional degrees. An additional 10.4 have some college education. One likely factor, the large segment of Indian Americans who enter the country under the H-1B visa, I'm familiar with that program, which allow highly skilled foreign workers in designated specialty occupations to work in the U.S. See, that's important too, because we are in the highly skilled, what's in demand now is STEM. Science, technology, engineering, and math.
Which is what the Honorable Elijah Muhammad was trying to get us to since the 1950s and 60s. You would see big pictures and cartoon drawings in this paper. We need engineers. We need scientists. Yes, exactly. We need to learn mathematics.
So we could do what our original true Indian brothers and sisters and Asian Americans are doing
for the future.
Exactly.
The future is based in advanced science and technology.
Lest we be destroyed
science, technology, and engineering. Future shock. Yeah.
Yes.
This
is what happens when you don't prepare. Future shock,
and then you're obsolete.
Yes,
obsolete as a people. Which means you're headed on a one-way course to extinction.
Exactly, headed for self-destruction. Headed for self-destruction.
Systematic destruction. It's all a part of systematic destruction of people. Just like the Native American was systematically destroyed. And so
we have examples
of people. But one thing about the Indian from the subcontinent is he retained his culture.
Yes.
Most of them do. They know where, and even if they don't, they know where they're from. Right. They know their landmass. Here's a civilization that has never been totally conquered. Here are the people that has been on this planet for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. A civilization that goes back. So, I mean, we just was talking about the Harappans. That was at the southern tip of India.
Yeah.
And so here you have other civilizations that were prolific throughout India for thousands of years. And so when they come in contact with white supremacy, they already have a mind. They already know who they are. They're not disconnected from their mythologies. We just was at an Indian temple about a month or so ago. And it was a beautiful, fine institution. They had craftsmen come and craft their gods or the images of their gods or whatever you want to call them, and they produce and they develop a beautiful institution. And you almost thought you might have been in India itself.
Exactly.
When they come, they immediately use all the tools within their culture that they have had to advance themselves in this culture in the midst of American Western civilization here. And they've kept a knowledge of who they are. And so the problem with Black America and why we are at the bottom totem pole is because we don't have our own mythology. Our mythology has become we have adopted the oppressor's mythology and accepted it as ours. Like this land is our land, that we have a part or parcel of the American dream, that we are 100% full citizens, when at every turn we're being marginalized and discriminated against, which shows us and reinforces the reality that we are not full and complete citizens, which shows the foolishness in us adopting the norms and the mythologies of our oppressors. And so thus, we need a new culture, we need a new mythology, we need a new way to approach the reality that we are experiencing.
So we have many examples from various successful ethnic groups on multiple levels of how to survive amid destructive elements from a conquistador culture.
Exactly.
We're still dealing with the post-conquistador.
Well, it's still conquering.
Yes,
it's still conquering. We call it cultural
business is war.
And capitalism is oppression.
As we've been saying for years. So we need a new culture. I'd say a conscious culture. Now, what do you mean by that? Conscious culture. Let's take it a step further. Let's go even higher than positive and negative culture.
Right.
Let's go to a culture created via the development of volition and willpower. From conscious men and women who underwent a transformation.
Exactly. And this is where Elijah Muhammad was trying to lead us to the door of. He talked about us developing a new mind, a new way of thinking. He called it supreme wisdom, which means the God's way of thinking. He said, we won't learn how to think like prophets no longer or servants. We will learn to think like the gods of the prophets. We will learn to have a superior mindset where we looked at ourselves as not only as one in harmony with each other, but one in harmony with nature. Where we would not only approach life intelligently, but we would approach life dynamically. And where we would take charge of our own destiny and be the captain of our own ship.
Captain of our own ship. Captains of our consciousness.
Captains of our own
gods and goddesses. I want to clarify what I mean by gods and goddesses so I don't sound like someone who's a religious fanatic or delusional. Being educated in the sciences and so on. When I say gods and goddesses, I mean conscious creators of a higher civilization. A society, a civilization characterized by egalitarianism, equality, justice, and harmony. Right, Bro Muhammad?
Exactly.
And we have examples of that in the past. The ancient Egyptian concept of Ma'at, which Bro Muhammad knows way more about. So please speak on that briefly as we talk about the need for a conscious culture, a higher culture.
When we talk about Ma'at, we're talking about people who started off with a small culture and began to refine and develop that culture over a period of time. It comes from a certain viewpoint that you look at the world. And the mythologies that they had helped support their viewpoint. And that was that all of life is sacred. That You are sacred. The ant that is on the ground is sacred. The animal that is rummaging through the woods and the forest is sacred. Even the rodent, which we so lovingly hate with all our passion, the rat, has a sacredness to him. All of life is sacred because can you create life? Can you make life? No. You can't make life like you make this bottle of water in a factory. It's sacred. You can't reproduce it in a factory. I can't carve out a body out of clay mud like one European tried to do years ago. I can't carve a body and make a body out of clay mud and put my breath in it and it comes to life. No. So therefore, life is something that's precious, it's something that's sacred. The ancient Kemites understood that. And by them having that perception of the sacredness of life, they wanted to be just towards life, because just as I want justice towards myself, I have to be just towards you. Just as I have the right to live, I have the right to thrive, I have the right to be free, so do the animals in nature. Just as, and all of this is based on Mat. Mat essentially means to do the beautiful, to do that which God wishes, wills, and love. To bring into existence the greatest good to flow forth from to allow the greatest good to flow forth from your heart. It's righteousness.
So this is where the concept of the Summum Bonum stems from, correct?
Exactly.
The Greco-Roman.
Exactly.
Tradition.
Exactly. From the ancient Nile Valley culture, which they themselves didn't really call it Ma. Ma is what academics, in particular Milan and Karenga, stamped on their culture. But if you study a lot of early Egyptologists and a lot of African people that study Egypt back in the days, they didn't really call it Ma. Ma is what we use as a trade name for it now, but we could call it submission to the will of God. We could call it doing the beautiful. We can call it the Summum Bonum. We can call it a host of many different names, and the ancient Kemites did themselves, but it all was orientated on the establishment of high culture, high value systems, high norms, which what we mean by high is that which is advanced intelligence, that which established justice and equality between our fellow man and all of nature. We meant by high a culture or a lifestyle that was in harmony, in tune with the rhythm of the universe. So here, when they considered civilization or culture, they looked at the full 360 degrees of life, not only their own selves, but of life in general. And they wanted to establish harmony, a right relation to the whole of life. And that's called Mat. When we talk about the need for a new consciousness, a conscious society, a conscious culture.
The need for a conscious culture.
We're talking about not just, oh, I'm black and I'm proud. That's just black awareness. That's just a knowledge of your history. That's not really what consciousness is. When we talk about a conscious culture, we're talking about a culture where the individual reflects on his or her deeds and how, in relation to how they treat themselves, how they treat others, how they even approach their own mind. It takes a certain degree of sincerity. It takes a certain degree of willingness to expand beyond your own egocentric, your own rugged individualism. It demands that you want for your brother and sister what you want for yourself. It demands that you get in tune with the whole of yourself, and that you take control over the power of your thoughts, over the power of your feelings, over the power of your behaviors, and that you're observing them so that you can weigh and measure which action is proper and right action, and which action is harmful or destructive.
That's going back to the scales of Ma'at we see on the hieroglyphs.
Exactly.
Now that's in stark contrast to American-style capitalism and many forms of mixed capitalism we find in economies around the world.
Exactly.
America is characterized by rugged individualism, crony capitalism,
right,
greed,
exactly, and what you have in
selfishness, instant gratification,
and that's what you have. And what do we see? What we get out of divide, and out of that system of crony capitalism and rugged individualism, you have a dog-eat-dog, greedy cultural context in which people live in. And from that standpoint, this is where you'll rob somebody and take his life for some money, because money trumps everything. Here you have where pharmaceutical companies and research institutes actually have pretty much the cures to many modern ailments, or they know the triggers that causes many of these modern ailments.
Yet they hold back
because of money.
Because of money.
It's all about the greed. It's all about rugged individualism. It's all about profit trumping humanity.
Exactly.
Whereas in the ways of conscious culture, as it has expressed itself in many different forms around the world, is you put humanity above profit. That the well-being of the whole is greater than the money that's going into my bank account. And so when we talk about rising up with a conscious culture, it's not a culture of wearing dashikis and toting black power. It's a culture of mind elevation, where you are no longer chained and a prisoner to those norms and practices, mentally, emotionally, and in terms of behavior, that are destructive to not only your well-being and the life and development of your brain and your mind, but we're talking about a culture that promotes the development of your mind, a culture that promotes mastery over your thought, that promotes mastery over your feeling, a culture that causes restrictions and puts restraints on the body and its behaviors and its impulses.
Yes, the cultivation of a righteous mind.
Yes, and that's the beginning of conscious culture.
The cultivation of a righteous mind.